Hey everybody, Glenn Curry here from the H2O Studios. Today we have an in-studio guest. His name is Tom Podhrazsky. I met him because he's at the gallery that we're going to be talking about right across the street, right here in Public Square. But Tom offers not just his expertise at artwork as an artist and one of, I believe, 8 or 9 artists at the gallery, but he also has an extensive background of international architecture and his experience going around the world. He lives up here in Watertown or in the area, and it's fascinating, gentlemen. I've been speaking to him not only about his art, but his design capability and how he actually will sit there with either an easel or whichever, and he'll use what is referred to as ink washing, very similar to watercoloring, except with no color. Without further delay, let's say hi to Tom. Tom, say hi to everybody.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, no, thank you. Thanks for being with us today. And again, I mean, you're one of how many artists at FIB?
At last count, one of 9. And so the way the gallery works is that it's basically a collective of artists. And so there's 8 or 9 of us, and there were a core group that had founded it. But we all pay monthly dues, and in exchange for those monthly dues, we have gallery space, and we all pool together our resources to try to advertise the work that we do. I've just recently been here for just under a year. And because I'm new here, I'm really interested in trying to get my work out there and to reach out to the community. And so because of that, I'm taking some extra effort to try to promote the gallery and the hopes of maybe finding someone that might want to purchase my art.
Yeah, and you've had some success since you've been there. A lot of people have looked at Tom's art, and I'm just going to showcase some stuff right from your website. And here we have it. I mean, this might be a little hard for people to see, but I'm just going to scroll down real quickly here. And this, again, is called ink wash. Is that correct, Tom?
Yeah, so it's a really old technique of doing drawings, and it's I like it because it's sort of fast and fluid. It's got this organic feeling to it. You know, like with an oil painting, it can take weeks to work on it. But
yes.
The beauty of this is that you can travel light with it because you only need a few simple tools. You need a good watercolor brush, nice paper, pencil, and then a pen and nib. You know, like you would see in old cartoons of calligraphers that you would have they would dip the pen in the ink bottle and draw with it. So
right.
That's basically a tool that I use, and some water and a drawing surface. And so it's great because you can go. I go out on a hike, and in the woods, I'll sit down and do a drawing. Or if I'm driving down the road, I'll just keep some in my car. And if I see a beautiful building and I got the time,
right.
I'll just pull over on the side of the road, set myself up, and do drawings right there. And the reason that that's really important is because I really believe in drawing from life.
Yes.
I think that when you're actually observing something and trying to put it down on a piece of paper, that there's a magic that happens that doesn't happen when you're just trying to copy from a photograph.
True.
And so on one hand, it's more difficult, right? Because the light changes.
Light changes all the time.
And rain can happen,
sure.
and it gets hot or cold or whatever else. But
right.
I think all of that sort of adds to it, and that's the way that it used to be done. If you look at a lot of great paintings and artists, they would go out in life and do a simple study or a sketch, and then bring that maquette back to the studio, and then they would do the giant painting.
Right, right.
So for me, it serves multiple purposes. One of them is that I really believe strongly in drawing as a tool for learning. And I think I've talked to you about this before, Glenn, where anyone could take a picture and you mindlessly take 100 pictures and you have the record of it, but you don't actually know anything about what you're taking a picture of.
Right, exactly.
But if you have to draw it, that forces you to look very, very carefully at the subject and try to copy it. And I'm not a printer, right? So that I make mistakes.
Sure.
But when you make a mistake, you look at it and say, this doesn't look right.
Right.
Why is this wrong?
Right.
And then you look back and you say, oh, okay, because the window is actually over 5 feet.
At a different angle.
At a different angle,
right,
or
right.
that detail isn't quite the way I have it drawn. And in the process of doing that, you learn a lot about what makes a building, and you learn a lot about what makes them look good, because you can see a building and you'd be completely stunned. But unless you take time to try to take it apart mentally and figure out why it looks so beautiful, you're not really learning anything.
Well, let me ask you this. Were you the type of, when you were a kid, did you get like a model and just tear it apart and try to figure out what made it, what made it work, like something with a little motor in it? What you were an engineer at an early age, or did you look at things with an analytical mind, Tom?
I always enjoyed Legos.
Right,
That was my favorite toy.
Erector sets?
I didn't really get erector sets,
right.
but they had called Technics. It was Lego Technics. It was like their version of a erector set, and I always enjoyed playing with Matchbox cars and like running them around on the highways and organizing spaces.
Right.
I'd always been a really careful kid. My nieces and nephews are amazed that they're playing with my toys because they tend to be more destructive. So I would always been very careful. But yeah, I was always interested in drawing and art as a kid too. So this is building and drawing have always been a different side of the same coin.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. What would you consider yourself? Are you an artist and a designer, or what are you, Tom?
Oh, that's hard.
That's a hard question.
Yeah, well, because I do construction work as well, right? So I think of this all as different facets of one thing. Like I imagine what the ideal builder would be, looking back to antiquity and the people who designed some of these great buildings. And, and I think that all of these skills that I'm talking about are not only necessary, but they're necessary, but even beyond that, that's what makes it, right? Like, I don't believe that you can truly be a great carpenter unless you understand something about design.
Right.
And I don't believe that you can truly be a great designer without understanding how things get built. And I think if you talk to architects and you talk to carpenters, the biggest complaints that you're going to have is exactly that there's a contractor who's exceptionally skilled, but doesn't know which way the molding is supposed to go.
Right.
And then it's very, very common, almost comically so, that engineers and designers will draw things that just can't be built.
Yeah, no, and again, I'm trying, and it's funny that you should say that, because you should be on this end, because I'm trying to reconfigure your webpage here so we can see the actual drawings, because for some reason or other I just blew them up, but I'll fix that as we go here. But your website also includes or not all of your ink wash drawings, but we could see your ink wash drawings right at FIB, right at the gallery across the street.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've got some that are hanging on the wall, and I've also got a little bin there that you can flip through and see them.
So when people buy art from the gallery, and again, it's been open. I forgot to mention that. Is it still open in Clayton, Tom, or is this the second location, or is it a seasonal thing up there in Clayton?
No, they moved, so they're no longer in Clayton.
Gotcha.
They're just here in Watertown.
Okay. So, and I can attest to this. Obviously, the building I'm in is owned by the same building that owns your gallery, and that's Jake Johnson. He's taken old buildings. Yours isn't as old as the one we're sitting in right now, but it was a small space. But you've really utilized a lot of space there. You've opened it up to what used to be a jewelry store on the other side of the wall. Before you came here years ago, it was a very famous jewelry store. But now it just has a very, very good feel to it, and I love that corner. You are on the most famous corner in Jefferson County. You're on the American corner, Tom, and everyone can see that. So hopefully people can appreciate the fact that not only is it a great location, but there's a lot of great art in there as well.
Yeah, we're very, very lucky. Jake Johnson did a wonderful job with renovating the building. It feels like a top-notch gallery space.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so how many artists are in there right now? And again, what can one expect in as far as, there's a lot of diversity. Are you the only one that does the ink wash drawings, Tom? Are you the only one with that type of style?
No, there's one other artist that has some up. But the beautiful thing about the gallery is that there's a great diversity of works. So there's anywhere from photography and pencil drawings to ceramics and jewelry and oil paintings. And that's sort of by design, is that they want to have a bunch of different artists that do different work, so that we can have something for everybody. Mm-hmm.
And you definitely have something for everybody. But let me ask you this. You are also a man of the world, if you will. Tom and I were talking about a couple of things about the gallery and your experience. Not to mention, Tom, that you are pretty much, the way Tom dresses, and this is exactly the way he dresses, very much like a Connecticut cutout, if you will. Very, very Yankee-like there, Tom. Collegiate. Tweed jacket, the wool jacket and whatnot, but it would not be uncommon for Tom to go into any given bar in town, because Tom doesn't discriminate, and I won't say the names of the bars because it's none of my business, but they're not the bars that you would think Tom would actually go into. So Tom, what is it about bars and that the fact that you would go in and read a book at a local bar, and what type of reaction you get from that?
Well, I've always just grown up around artistic and interesting people. And I moved up here from Charleston, South Carolina, and there's a really
big step.
There's a vigorous drinking culture in Charleston.
Is there really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of bars in Charleston, just like there's a lot of bars here in Watertown.
Right.
And after spending years of trying to find, it's sort of like, there's a children's story about. The lady eating the porridge, and this one's too hot. And
yeah. But why did she eat the fly? I don't know why, or maybe that's another one.
No.
I don't know my nursery rhymes all that well.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there's after trying out a bunch of different bars, I just felt myself being most comfortable in a dive bar because people there's no pretensions at all.
Right.
People are just there to have community, and they're going to have a beverage after work,
Right.
and they just shoot the breeze, and
Right.
and I really appreciated that. And growing up, being around artistic people, they're not oftentimes the really polished people that put on airs.
Right. True.
And that really bothers me. I don't want to put on airs either. And I've spent a lot of time, especially on the construction side of my life. I mean, I was a carpenter and worked as helpers for electricians and running through factories and pulling cables and doing dirty work. I know it doesn't look like it.
No.
But after spending a lot of time doing that, I just gained an appreciation for the fact that, there's different people have different things to bring to bear.
Right.
And just because someone may not be a smooth talker, or just because someone doesn't understand philosophy or doesn't want to talk about books or opera or ballet,
right.
It doesn't mean that they're stupid.
No.
And I remember this was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. I was studying in Washington, D.C. at university, and I wanted to be a history professor. So, I wanted to dress like this every day and have the elbow patches and the pipe and profess.
And the pipe. I was going to say you need a pipe.
Yeah, right. So I wanted to do that, and then, but I've got this love for historic architecture and buildings, and I realized that, being a history major would be interesting, but it just wasn't going to be the direction I needed to go to. So my father, he worked at the McCormick factory in Maryland, where they make spices. And I took a sabbatical from school, and I was supposed to go work with a contractor, but that was when the bottom fell out in 2008 with the economy. So I ended up working for these electrical contractors. And I went from debating Aristotle and politics to listening to guys talk about, chasing women and fixing cars. And some of these guys, they'd never left the county that they grew up in. Like, this was in Maryland, and they'd never been to Baltimore and never been to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And,
not that far away.
It's really not far away. Yeah, an hour maybe at most. So at that time, I'd already been lucky enough to travel around and see parts of the world. And so for me, it was a huge change. And I got myself in trouble quite a lot because I would say things without thinking that would offend these guys. And then at the end of these 6 months of working with this crew, I began to learn a few things. And one of them is that intellect is relative to the task at hand, right? So you can take Bill Gates, love him or hate him, whatever, but he was an intelligent guy who has a certain skill set that is obviously valuable.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
He's done very well.
Yeah, he's done very well for himself. But if you were to put a hammer in his hand and tell him to go frame up a wall, you could watch his IQ fall through the floor, right? And likewise, you could take a small child who's grown up out in the country, and he could run circles around someone like that, fixing cars and doing all this stuff. And who am I to say what's more valuable? You need all those things.
No doubt.
Right. So after spending a lot of time working with in that sort of environment, I realized that all this stuff, the emphasis you put on the upper crust of society, isn't what it's made out to be.
Not at all.
It's not at all.
Yeah.
And so when I go into a dive bar, like I dress like this because this is the way that makes me feel best.
That's what makes you feel comfortable.
This is how I feel comfortable.
Right.
And I know that it looks like I'm a stiff, but I'm honestly not a stiff.
No, you're not.
This is just how I want to be.
Sure.
And sometimes that makes other people uncomfortable, but then I start talking to them, and then I don't know how, but somehow I'm able to relate to lots of different people from different walks of life, and I'm very, very grateful for that because I think otherwise you're missing out. So,
well, I mean, I can, because I'm a big fan of like a lot of TV shows like Cheers. Are you the Fraser Crane of Northern New York when you walk in like that, like a professor?
I hope not.
Well, no, I happen to like Fraser Crane, of course. Kelsey Grammer.
Kelsey Grammer,
but again, he was the type of guy that you had Norm, you had Cliff, you had the blue collar guys, if you will, and there's another, and like you said, so what you're getting down to is like you might look like an elitist, Tom, but you're definitely not an elitist.
No. And this is one thing while working with those groups of people that I struggled with is like, how can you be honestly interested in something that is typically considered upper crust, like opera, or philosophy? And how can you talk about something like that without sounding like an asshole?
Right. Yeah. True.
Because a lot of people, they get really defensive, because it's not a common thing. It's like, it's not, there's a reason why you have to go to New York City to see an opera,
right?
Or some other big cities, because most people don't have an interest in it, and that's perfectly okay, But it's just, and I think the key to it is approaching someone without assuming that they're an idiot. It's like, I'm going to talk about a show that I saw, and I liked it, and I'm just going to share this with you, and then reached someone at their level. You know,
Right.
so if you can kind of look at someone and gauge,
Right, you can.
and you know if you're going to say certain things, that it's probably not going to mesh too well.
Right.
So you sort of you edit yourself. But I don't think there's any reason why you can't take a subject matter and talk to somebody about it.
Well, and it goes both ways. I mean, in your case, obviously you know a lot about design, you know a lot about history, you've been around the world. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the same time, you can learn a lot from anybody who've had a life experience. That person could be a high school dropout. And I'm not discrediting anyone who is a high school dropout or doesn't have an education beyond the high school level. But you can always learn by something. At the end of the day, if vocation didn't exist, you and I wouldn't be sitting here right now.
Yeah.
And vocation, on the other hand, is something that's being lost. A lot of these kids are going to college at all levels. It doesn't matter if it's a state college, Ivy League, private schools. They all want to be lawyers. They all want to be something other than someone that would actually build the house that we're going to need in the future. So that you're kind of a hybrid of all that, Tom. You're an intellect, and you know both sides of the story.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm grateful to have parents that were supportive of me in whatever I wanted to do. I've had, parents of friends that when I told them that I was going to leave the school I was at, which was a pretty decent school, and go to learn how to be a carpenter, they about fell out of their chairs. And my parents were very supportive of that, and I'm grateful for it. But I think, honestly, pushing everyone to college is a mistake. I think I personally really value a liberal arts education. I think
doubt.
that there's a great amount that people can learn from it.
Sure.
But I also don't think that if you're a carpenter, it means that you're an idiot.
No. Not at all. And by the way, just famous carpenters, I think Jesus was a carpenter. I think his father was too.
Yeah.
And getting into the 20th century, so was a guy like Harrison Ford, for instance, who was a carpenter before he became obviously a famous actor. So what is what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to your website because I figured that out. And I'm just going to be very careful because I blew it up and I didn't know how to get back to that. But this first image we have here that we have on the monitor for you, Tom, explain that. That is a famous building right in downtown Sackett's Harbor. And you literally sat out there and you did your ink wash. How long ago did you do this? This
was
work
a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2019.
That's beautiful. So explain, what inspired you to paint that?
Okay. Well, my family has lived here for a long time, and I didn't have a chance to really explore Sackett's Harbor, but they had told me that it's beautiful and there's a lot of historic buildings. So I packed up my easel and my drawing supplies, and I got in the car, and really early in the morning, the sun was still rising, and I drove out there. And I just settled down and started walking around. And then I saw for the very first time the Union Hotel. This old, beautiful stone building. I'm sure that it's beautiful. And I was just stunned by this thing. So I just sat down right there in front of it and just started sketching. And I focused in on this front entrance that I thought it was really dramatic. There's this elliptical archway with this sort of federal style entrance and windows. And it was really a romantic, beautiful thing. And so I took out my ink wash and a brush and pen, and started to just very quickly try to get the essence of what it is that was there.
And you did the same thing here at a building. I believe this is in Charleston, South Carolina, Tom?
Yeah. This drawing actually took a lot longer because developing the structure of the building and getting the proportions right actually takes quite a lot of time. And it's always it's like with painting a house. It's always the prep that takes the longest amount of time.
Sure, it does.
Once you have everything laid out, then laying ink wash and doing the pen work isn't quite that arduous.
And you have a lot of these works at the gallery, and here's another one. This one is a Sackett's Harbor. Now, if you told me that this was done over 100 years ago, I'd believe you. But you have that old style look with that sepia design. Explain where this is, Tom.
Yeah, so this is right on the water in the harbor in Sackett's,
Right.
and this is on that same day where I just did a number of drawings just in the afternoon or throughout the course of the day.
So you will literally set up shop, if you will. Do you have an easel, or how do you set it up? I mean, you travel light, like you said. How do you do that?
I try to avoid having an easel, so I have like a portfolio that's it's a hardback portfolio, and I store my paper in it, and then when I'm drawing, I'll just take out a sheet and just tape it to the easel and just to the portfolio and stick it in my lap. So that way I really travel light. But I've got a travel easel if I need it.
Now, in this particular image we have up there, it looks obviously you do have some ink on that I can see more on this image than you did on the others. There's less wash, if you will. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Tom. But is this the same building in Charleston?
Yeah, this is the same one. And that's actually the first type of this drawing I had done. So I studied in New York City at a school called the Grand Central Atelier. They offered classes in this, and it's a classical Beaux-Arts style art school. And it just takes a lot of practice. So the first one I did was stiffer because it takes an understanding of where a line needs to be and how much you can leave out with and how much you need to include in order to have a cohesive drawing. But yeah, that first drawing took quite a bit of time.
So that not bad for a first drawing, by the way. And here's others. These are a little different. This is what type of artwork design is this, Tom?
So these are just travel sketches. So Glenn, you had mentioned before about my travels, and part of the reason that I traveled was just to learn about architecture. Most people go to architecture school, and that's how they learn how to do things. And that's a fine path, but it was just a path that was not available to me. So I could either just give up or just find another way to figure out how to do what I wanted to do. And so that's what I did. And I looked to history, and I realized that many of the great architects and designers who came before us went on grand tours. It was this European tradition. It was typically of the upper crust. You had to be able to afford to do this. But they would take off, in their early 20s or late teens, and they would travel to regions of Rome or Greece, and they would go study antiquity, and then do drawings, and then come back with this new knowledge. And based on that, they would practice architecture. So I'm not particularly very wealthy, but I was able to live frugally and save up money. And I would look through my architecture history book, and I say, I really should go to Rome. And so I would save up money for an airline ticket, and I would make sure that I spaced it out long enough ahead of time. So I would plan 6 months in advance, and I would buy my ticket, save up money for it, and then I'd give myself weeks to save up money for the actual trip. So I would go through cycles of being broke.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Starving
artist, no?
Yeah, basically, eating lots of beans and rice.
Right.
But I was able to buy that ticket, and then my work situation was flexible enough that I could tell people ahead of time. I said, look, in 8 weeks, I'm going to be out of town for 2 weeks, and it worked. So I would go, and then I would travel, and again, like I was saying before, taking a picture is one thing, and I've got plenty of pictures.
I'm sure you do.
But I thought it was really important to just draw, because I wanted to really get an understanding of what it is I was looking at.
Well, let me just say, because it looks like this is a wide range of different locations. Where was this drawing? Where did you do this, Tom?
This drawing is in Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan. Explain. That's a faraway place in Asia, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, it's in Central Asia. It's actually it shares a border with Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and all the stands.
Is that where Borat is from, or am I being very?
Borat was Kazakhstan.
Sorry, I know it's a stand.
Yeah, it's the same region.
I'm doing a little pop culture here with Tom, so I had to throw that in.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So that was Uzbekistan, and the next one is this is like a mosaic. What is that all about?
That's also in Uzbekistan. So there was I think it was in Samarkand, that there's this famous giant tower, and it's made out of brick, but it's got this pattern that's along the side of it. The geometrical patterns are really popular in Asia, and especially in the Middle East. And so I wanted to try to copy that.
Next one up looks very Middle East. Where's this?
Oh, that's also in Uzbekistan, actually.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So
fascinating. Yeah. Now, I know you and I discussed this. You've been all over the place. You've been in Japan, Istanbul.
Yeah.
You've also been to Cuba. Now, where's this right here? That looks very Romanesque.
Actually, that's in South Carolina.
South Carolina, there you go.
Yeah.
So isn't it interesting? Obviously, we see so much of the architecture from other continents in America, and a lot of people that were instrumental behind that. Were our founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin. Also, George Washington hired I believe, an Irish immigrant because of his experiences and his way of designing, for instance, the White House design. So a lot of Europe, a lot of Asian design is here in America.
Sure.
And without that, we wouldn't, again, we have a lot of British influence, a lot of German influence. But what do you like the most as far as the influence here in America from other faraway places, Tom?
Oh, well, that's pretty hard to say. Right. I mean, like you were saying, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, of the designers that came before us. I mean, my personal preference is early American architecture, and so that stems from a lot of British and Georgian ideals of architecture that in the Federalist period, just after the Revolution, in America we were keen and eager to create our own version of architecture. And to look back on it and see it in comparison to what we were rebelling against, it really doesn't look that much different.
Right.
But there's a certain spirit of America that imbued itself within our arts and the architecture of the early colonial period and the federal period that really speaks to me.
And you mentioned also, I mean, again, Tom and I had the luxury of talking about other things, but you went to Cuba. Now, it was a 2-week trip. You went to a lot of places in the Caribbean. Cuba was one of them.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you know what, Tom's going to tell me at the end of this conversation that he loved Cuba. And I'm not saying you didn't love it, but at the end of the day, because your parents, I believe, came from Czechoslovakia when it was communist rule, and they came here and they fled from that. And you saw a lot of the effects of communism or dictatorship, that is. And Cuba wasn't your favorite place, Tom, from what you were saying.
Yeah, I think I would have to say it was the least favorite place that I've traveled to.
And you've been all over the world, essentially.
I've been lots of places.
Right.
It's not to say that there weren't good things.
Right.
The music was great. The rum was fantastic. But as you were saying, my parents, they had to escape a communist country. And so for me growing up, I heard lots of those stories.
Sure.
And, when I was in Havana, there were other tourists that I saw from other countries, and they were having a great time. Mm-hmm. But I just couldn't unsee what I knew, and some people were looking at the beach and listening to the music, and I just couldn't stop looking at lines for bread and decrepit buildings that were falling apart.
Right.
And there's a common site in Cuba or in Havana where they have these giant water trucks. Where they'll be pumping water into cisterns in buildings. And the reason they have to do that is because the public water system is so decrepit that it doesn't reach some buildings. I went to a bookstore, and I was running around, and it was sort of ironic that there was a shelf that said Cuban literature, and there were no books on the shelves.
Wow.
And I wanted to go take a picture, and I was rushed out of the store.
Was that their way of saying we don't have literature here in a communist country? Or why would they have a sign of something and yet no literature to support it?
I think it's probably, there's a rich culture in Cuba. I'm sure that, I wouldn't go so far as to think that they don't have artists or writers.
Right.
But I think it's probably just supply, and a system like that, just getting basic resources is not so easy as if you have in a free market system.
Right. So, all right. So we've determined, obviously, that Tom Podhrazsky has a lot of talent in many areas, and they're intertwined with your artist work and also your architectural work. You're doing a big project right now, somewhere, I believe, in Western New York, for a convent. Is that correct? Can you tell us what that's all about, Tom?
Sure. This is in Jordanville, New York. There's a Russian Orthodox church there, and it's been there since the 50s. And within certain circles, it's rather famous. They've got a seminary there where they're training people to become priests, and they have a monastery, so monks are living there. And then there's also a church there, so that people and congregants can come and go to service. And alongside that, there is a group of nuns that are right now working towards creating their own monastery that's very close to the one that's existing. And so I've got some friends within the Orthodox community, and they introduced me to these nuns, and this has been one of my first major commission up here in New York.
Nice.
And so far it's been really wonderful. They're actually dream clients. It's some of the best clients I've ever had.
So is this an existing building that you're rehabbing or redesigning or bringing up to code, or is this a new building altogether, Tom?
This is a new building that's going to act as an addition onto an old one.
Gotcha.
So they have an 1830s farmhouse I think it's on 50 acres.
Wow.
Or maybe 100 acres. I don't know. It's a fairly large tract of land, and they need to expand and have dormitory rooms for nuns to sleep in, and they need to have a dining hall, and they're really industrious. They make candles and incense, and they've got alpaca, or they've got the wool, and so because they've got to fund themselves, so they want to have workshops, and so it's been really fun working with them, because there's an old building there that you can play off of, and it's on a historic site, but I get to start from the ground up.
But that said, you have to match the old look to it. It's not like it's going to be like a double wide next to an old building from the 19th century.
Oh yeah, of course.
Right.
That's one of the most important things when designing something new, is to take into account where you're putting it.
Right. Exactly.
And with my background in historic preservation, I feel very strongly that you shouldn't try to overwhelm what's already there.
Right.
And
it's got to complement.
Yeah, it's got to complement it. And my background in Charleston, that's what I did a lot of times, is that developers would purchase a historic house. In Charleston, you're not allowed to tear down a historic house. It has to be saved. But they'll get a house with a big lot, and then they'll hire me to design with the restoration, and then we'll work on doing a small building in the back. And so what typically happens is that when they have subdivide the lot and put a new building in the back, the new building's cheaper to build, but the revenue from the small building in the back helps to offset the cost of restoring the building in the front. So then they end up with two buildings, and the cost generally balances out. And it works out very well because, I mean, Charleston's a popular tourist destination. Lots of people want to live there.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay, so I'm going to get into the fact that you live in an old 1830-something house right here in Black River.
Yeah.
But do you miss Charleston? Because Charleston seems to be right up your alley. I mean, again, we have great architecture up here. You have family up here. You found yourself up here. You found Colasanti's, by the way, on Factory Street. I find that very fascinating. Great place. I just can't see Tom Podhrazsky at Colasanti's, but anything's possible, and I love that. I think it's awesome.
It's a great bar.
It is a great bar. There's no doubt about it. But do you miss Charleston, South Carolina, and the charm down there and the architecture and the people?
I miss my friends.
Okay.
Because I had a great community there.
Sure.
And then there is something about Southern hospitality and Southern charm that I really enjoy. But to be honest, I don't regret leaving. I came up here because I do have family here, but also Charleston was just getting overrun with people from off, and I get that I was one of those people, But 10
People,
years,
I don't understand. Explain that. Yankees like us, or
Yeah,
a
well,
little influence from the north.
yeah, well, and like me, right? I grew up in Maryland, so I can't. I was one of the invaders too. I guess
Right.
you
Well,
could say.
I considered Maryland a little bit south. Well, it's north of the Mason-Dixon line, but to me, it's south. But nonetheless, you were an outsider down to Charleston.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, but I love the culture, and I tried to delve into it, and I think most locals put up with me. But
Right.
but that's just what happens. And places become victims of their own success.
Yes, they do.
And 10 years ago, you'd walk down the street, and the old ladies would walk going down King Street, and they'd have the gloves and the hat, and they'd stop and say hello,
Right.
and you'd have a conversation. And it's still a really nice place, but it's becoming populated with people from off that
Right.
don't have the same culture, and so it gets diluted.
So it gets lost. The culture is lost, and to some degree, we see that everywhere, not just in Charleston, but even up here, as we go further from our roots, if you will. I mean, again, I just know the proud Italian culture here, and it's still here. Don't get me wrong, but it's not what it used to be.
Yeah.
And we have, the Irish Fest, one of the biggest events in the North Country, and everyone's Irish on St. Patrick's Day. Of course, this year was different, but I sense that we're kind of separating ourselves from that. I mean, the old days of being Italian and driving a Cadillac, for instance, now they're driving Subarus. Now, is that a reflection on things? Maybe it is, but I hear that all the time. So it's not a surprise that even a quaint town, a historical town like Charleston, doesn't have the same historical value, I guess, I guess it's because everything's in transition these days, Tom.
Well, I mean, there's still significant historic value, but it's just, for me personally, things were getting too fast.
Interesting.
And I didn't want to be away from my family.
Right.
And I felt that, when I left the greater Baltimore area, there were reasons for it, not just for leaving school. It just wasn't a very pleasant place for me to want to live.
Yeah.
And I found that Charleston that I have been living in becoming more and more like the Baltimore area that I had escaped.
Wait. Let me ask you that. So Baltimore obviously has gone through some incredible sagas. I mean, it's bad. It's an awful place. Not that everyone lives in the certain spot of Baltimore that we see tragically on the news all the time in terms of its crime rate and whatnot. But you saw the same thing happening in a small town like Charleston as well, Tom?
Well, I mean, I was in the suburbs,
Right.
so I can't speak to Baltimore City itself, but
Right.
as far as like traffic,
Sure.
the population has exploded in Charleston.
Hmm.
And there's good and bad with that. The good side is that all these historic buildings don't restore themselves. It costs money, obviously, and if there's people that want to live there, and there was already laws in the book saying that you must restore them,
Which is great. Yeah.
then that's a means to restore the building and bring back a lot of decrepit buildings, because Charleston in 1970s was probably very similar to Watertown in the 70s, and that
Right.
it was awful.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And of course, what Tom is talking about, it wasn't just the 70s, but it was the urban renewal under Johnson Act, beautification. Well, that was more or less of the highways and billboards under Lady Bird. But a lot of buildings in this town, and you're probably familiar with this because the gallery's literally right across the street from where over 100 buildings were torn down in 1966 alone, not to mention the Woodruff was torn down 10 years later. The idea then was that out with the old, out with the 19th century architecture, and in with the new. And yet, as early as the 80s and 90s, places like Syracuse were saying, let's bring them back. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of buildings in the process. I was showing you pictures earlier of, the Flatiron building right here in Watertown that was torn down in 1966. Again, granted, they were old, but if we just held on to them, Tom, we'd have a lot more historical value around here.
Well, and I think the model that you see in Charleston, though it's flawed in some way as being a victim of his own success,
Sure.
is a success because they kept on to hold on to those buildings.
Which is important.
Yeah, well, and in Watertown, I keep telling people, like, there's a whole lot of potential here. You've got great historic buildings. And, the quality of life here is good. The summertime is amazing. People are really friendly. I honestly enjoy living here. But I feel like more people would want to live here if they could just push it. Watertown's got the resources. They've got it inherently here.
No question.
It was built hundreds of years ago.
Yes.
And all we got to do is just bring it back to its glory, and that's a hell of a lot easier than building something from scratch.
That's very true. And again, I've lived here for a little over 33 years now, and I've seen even within that time, it's a long time frame, don't get me wrong, ups and downs. The biggest significant change is Public Square was rebuilt about 12 years ago, and a lot of things have come back, and this place used to be a lot worse. But in your case, you moved up here and you found a house in Black River. Now, Black River is a very historic town. It's a beautiful hamlet, if you will. But you live in a house that was built in 1830-something, Tom? Explain that and what you've done to it since you moved there.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I love historic buildings.
Sure.
And so I was looking for one. And I really liked the 1830s, 1840s. That was the beginning of the Greek Revival period. And right now, that's the style that I really admire. So I found one, and it's not an ostentatious house. It was a small, like the ceilings are 7 foot tall. It was obviously built by people that were just farmers or whatever else.
Sure.
And then eventually additions were put onto it. And so I purchased it from a family that couple had lived there for 50 or 60 years. And they didn't want to sell it to just anybody. They wanted to sell it to someone who wanted to live there and then wanted to fix it up. And so I came and I sort of fit the bill. And
my goodness, you fit the bill.
I guess. So I've after spending about 10 years of fixing other people's houses and designing other people's projects, I just so desperately wanted to do something for myself. And that's one of the beauties about being up here is that the cost of real estate is affordable.
Oh, big time. In comparison to Charleston, that's for sure.
Absolutely. In Charleston, getting a house like I have here is untouchable.
Untouchable.
It's untouchable.
Although you'd be surprised. I mean, some people still say that our tax rate is much higher up here considering where we are. And rent has gone sky high in the last 10, 11 years. And a lot of that has to do with the developments in Fort Drum and some greedy landlords, in my opinion. But it is a lot less. So in your case, you bought a house that was just exactly what you wanted. The price was probably good.
Yeah.
But you put a lot of work into it since then.
Yeah. Well, the owners were really nice, and it was livable when I bought it, but their version of maintaining things seemed to be just like pasting more things on top of the things.
On top, old paneling and so on.
Yeah, the plaster's falling apart, so they would put wallpaper over it,
Right.
or more layers of press board, or
Drop ceilings.
Drop ceilings. I'm not
Shag rugs.
Shag carpets. Oh
Right,
yeah,
right.
from the 70s.
Sure.
And so I just can't have that in my house.
No. Not to mention, if you have allergies, you don't want that in your house.
Yeah.
I mean, that's 40, 50 years of allergies.
Yeah. Drop ceilings and shag carpets, they just had to go.
Right.
So I started sensitively ripping out all these things. And what I found, to much my amazement, was that there was really great stuff underneath. It just needed some love, a little bit of elbow grease.
Right.
So, plaster, and I've been teaching myself how to fix up plaster. And I think on my website, you might be able to find, I've got a image of one room in particular. It was upstairs. And when I bought the house, it was completely gutted. There had been a fire in there before, and it was just down to the studs. And so with my design work, it's good to have an office, and I need a place to put my books. And so I thought I was going to make it into my office.
We got them right here.
Oh,
You know what? I didn't know this was there. I'm glad you reminded me. Yeah, there you have it. Okay,
Yeah.
So some of these images, the one to the left there is obviously you took everything down. You gutted everything in that particular. It looks like what would be the living room there, Tom?
No, this was upstairs in a bedroom, and it was already gutted.
Okay. Oh,
So,
okay.
so the pictures you see where the studs and the windows, that's the condition it was in when I bought the house.
But look at that bookcase. Explain how you did that. That's awesome.
Yeah, so every architect has certain dreams and designer, and I've always loved paneled rooms, and paneled libraries are awesome. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't like it, right? So I just took this as an opportunity to just make my dream happen.
Right.
And so I had a friend who needed a job for the summer, so I hired him to come up work for me for a couple months, and so I designed everything in there, and then I've got some basic shop tools, basic table saw, some hand planes, and circular saw. And,
Yeah, but you learned all this, no? I mean, was it you self-taught or what?
well, no, I went to the College of the Building Arts.
Right,
so,
right.
In Charleston, I was trained how to be.
So they taught you everything, not just the principles behind it, but the hands-on. Everything was there for
absolutely.
you to learn.
Yeah, it was that school was basically a combination of trade school and liberal arts education.
Jeez.
So half the time you're in the shop learning how to use a handsaw and how to actually build things.
I mean, again, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's a lot of schools that have industrial arts, but you learned everything. Do other schools provide such an education in this area?
That's unfortunately the only school in the country that offers a bachelor's degree that has that program. I mean, there are some really great trade schools throughout the country, but none of them are quite the same thing as ACBA.
I guess not. Now, just as an example, Tom and I actually took the liberty of going upstairs in this particular building. Now, the building that we're in right now on Public Square, this was built, the parts of which are actually, from what I understand, when I did the history video of Watertown years ago, the foundation is actually from 1810, 1812 era, if you could believe that. Obviously, like many buildings around here, they've been rebuilt on existing foundations and so forth. So the sign out front says 1860. Now, you and I went upstairs to the third floor here, and what were your thoughts when you went up there, Tom?
Oh, I felt like
you were in heaven.
Yeah, I was like a pig in mud. I mean, part of my job in Charleston was going into decrepit old buildings and documenting them.
Right.
So, because you can't fix something if you don't know what's there.
Right.
So it was sort of like I showed you a picture the other day of like me looking like Indiana Jones.
Exactly.
It's sort of dangerous to be honest. Like sometimes I'd run into vagrants or like floors would fall through, but it's just what you got to do to fix these buildings.
Right.
And so we climbed up the ladder and went upstairs and saw this building that hadn't been touched for God knows how many decades, and it made me really excited.
Yeah, it did. I mean, other than the dead pigeon that was up there that we got to get rid of. One thing I definitely noticed is that obviously all the old 70s, whatever type of walls they had, like paneling and whatnot, that's all gone. Drop ceilings, all gone. The wallpaper, explain that. The wallpaper upstairs has this tapestry design from the 1910s, whichever, but it was bright red. It's falling off the walls, but that's the original wallpaper back in the day. Was that very common at the turn of the 20th century?
Yeah, well, because at the end of the Industrial Revolution, they used to be getting colors you had to get them from natural sources.
Right.
So like the purple was always the color of royalty because it was really hard to make purple.
Interesting.
But at the end of the Industrial Revolution, they had developed aniline dyes, which are artificially made. And then all of a sudden, you can get any color you want cheap.
Amazing.
So it went from being a luxury to being a common thing. And so, bright colors were the thing.
So let me ask you, I mean, as far as wallpaper is concerned, how old is wallpaper? Or was that something that happened after the Civil War during the American Industrial Revolution?
Wallpaper is, I'm not a historian of wallpaper, but there are people that specialize in it, believe it or not. But it's way, way older than that. I mean, in Middle Ages, you'd have these giant tapestries that they'd hang on the walls. And then developing further from that, you would actually have fabric that they would pin to walls. And then they could remove it or change it depending on the seasons or depending on what the fashion is. Like when they actually started pasting paper on walls, I'm not entirely sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was at the beginning of the 19th century.
Probably, yeah. And again, we're here. We have the liberty of saying we have over 200 years of great architecture here. Now, again, Watertown wasn't established, believe it or not, until 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was president. We had, Lewis and Clark had yet to explore the West. So we're relatively new, but yet we have a great, great cross-section of architecture here in the last 200 years. Where have we gone wrong in the last 56 years? I have my opinion, Tom, of where we've gone wrong. What do you think about American architecture at the latter part of the 20th century, especially after World War II?
Yeah. I personally am not a big fan of a lot of it.
I knew you wouldn't. Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah, but I've got a lot of empathy, and I think that's because the architecture and art that you saw after the 50s, with modernism in general, I believe was a reaction against a lot of really terrible things that happened. Look at World War I and World War II, and it completely tore the world apart and turned everything upside down.
Right.
And all people wanted to do was to get as far away from whatever caused it as possible.
And be efficient.
And be efficient, right? And then so it's the rise again with the modernization of industry and technology, and looking to the moon and all cars and futurism and wanting to go fast.
Sure.
There was just this disdain for everything that had come before.
Right.
They wanted to throw it out the window.
Just like urban renewal.
And then invent something new.
Right.
But I think the problem with that is that when it takes a true genius to invent something new, right? And you look at someone like, but even someone who's a true genius can only go but so far from what they know, right? Like Michelangelo, genius.
Right.
Da Vinci, genius.
Genius.
There were many other developers and designers who were genius. But to the untrained eye, if I were to show you one of Michelangelo's buildings in comparison to a Renaissance building, it's really hard to tell the difference and to see why he was a genius. So I think when people try to completely make something anew, that there's a lot of ego at play. And when ego is at play, that there's a risk of doing lots of damage. And I think a lot of the work done in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even into the 80s and 90s, the sort of postmodern architecture was regrettable.
Yeah, no question. I mean, just a quick look at what used to be the core of Watertown between Court and Arsenal Streets. Again, where the Flatiron Building, well, I refer to it as a Flatiron Building, but because it was right at the corner. But beyond that, we had the Avon Theater, which was the Opera House. We had the Armory there. We had all types of hotels. We had a movie theater. Again, all these, aged over time like anything else. But just to your credit, I mean, and this is something I learned from watching Tucker Carlson, of all people, is that after World War II, efficiency was the most important thing. In order to get 100 men to be transported on some type of tugboat, we had to design that boat first. We didn't think about comfort. We certainly didn't think about safety. And I think as a result of that, we started building skyscrapers in the post-war era, just to basically with that same mindset. Just get the people in there, build a tubular design. Of course, concrete and steel and glass really, saw leaps and bounds at that point. So we just forgot about, Gothic designs like the old Woolworth building in Lower Manhattan. And we just went with designs that look like, to me, it looks like salt shakers these days. So that's where I think we went wrong. But I don't know whether or not we can ever go back to the old values again.
Well, but I think we are. Part of the problem with modern architecture and just modernity in general is that people rely on technology to try to solve problems that had already been solved previously, but they just want to do it faster and better and cheaper, right? So a really good example, if you look at a building built in the 1970s, with all the modern technology of that day.
No windows.
Yeah. If you look at one of those buildings today, the odds are that it's in serious need of repair.
Right.
Right. And if you look at buildings that were built in the 30s with the modern technology of those days, they're in serious need of repair today. But they've lasted a long time. And if you look at buildings from the late 1800s with the simple technology that they've lasted a long time, but when people are trying to invent something new and reinvent the wheel, there are oftentimes many benefits to those new inventions, but there's always underlying problems that you just don't know about.
Right.
I'm forever skeptical of brand new technology. A great example is like vinyl siding.
Right.
I remember 10 or 15 years ago, it was the thing.
Fades, burns, melts.
Right. Yeah. It was maintenance free.
Right.
It's the best thing since sliced bread.
Right.
And they could say that because hadn't been around long enough for problems to show up.
Right.
It's like, I know that wood's going to rot. So what do? You paint it. Right. But I don't know what's going to happen to vinyl. So you spend $10,000 or $15,000 residing your house, and you don't have to maintain it. But surprise, surprise, at the end of 10, 12 years, everything fades, starts to get brittle and crack.
Right.
And then you don't have to maintain it, but you can't fix it.
No, yeah, exactly.
So you have to, you can replace one piece, but then your house is going to start looking like a Dalmatian with all kinds of different colors. And so then you have to tear it all down and throw it away. So what you're seeing, it started with historic preservation, but I think also in general, there's a revival and renewed interest in traditional building materials. And I think that's really important. And I think that speaks to what I'm just getting at is that that stone's going to last forever.
Right.
Or almost forever.
Right.
That a copper roof is going to last almost forever.
Right.
And especially today with sustainability and all the energy that goes into constructing a building, that's why I believe so strongly, or one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in historic preservation. It's because, First Baptist Church over there, that's been there for 100 years.
Right.
And if we do a little bit of maintenance, it's going to stay there for 100 years.
Actually, as of this year, 130 years to be exact.
See,
but
I stand corrected.
And the limestone facade, beautiful place. But, going much further beyond that, of course, you got the pyramids have been around, 4,000 years.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how the heck we built them. I watch those ancient alien shows on I'm sure you do as well. So I'm fascinated with all that. So, when you look at, for instance, the image image that I have up here, that hotel that you painted in Sackett's Harbor, that was built in, I believe, the early 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. So
absolutely.
that type of building right there is going to be around a lot longer than you and I, of course, if it doesn't burn down. But the structure is going to be there a lot longer than the buildings that have been built just in the last 40 years.
Well, and also the buildings that we've built within the last 40 years are still going to be around, but it's just, they're going to decay,
right.
you know? And that's why I also think it's really important to design a building that's beautiful, right? Because this is not just about us, right? You know, you can, there's so many things in this world that we just throw away.
Right.
And, you know, you can debate whether the value of that, and I'm not going to now. But like a building, it's supposed to last at least long enough for us to live in it, right? And most oftentimes it's going to outlast our lives. And so if you're going to spend the energy to make something that's going to be there for a long time, just make it look good.
Right, right.
You know, so many people just, they assume that making something look good is going to make it more expensive, but that's not true. You know, my favorite example, especially locally, is you drive out and, you know, on Route 12 and you see the Amish farms.
Yes.
You know, those are not expensive buildings. They are not designed by architects. But the reason that those buildings look good is because they're using traditional materials and they're using just a basic formula that they've always used. It's sort of the tradition.
Right.
And if you look at those houses, they look great.
They do. They do. They're very functional. I believe that a lot of them have tin roofs, or it's very efficient so that they don't have to screw with them.
Yeah.
And pardon the pun. And that they're there for a very long time. So, but in our case, obviously, Watertown is such an old town. I mean, old in the respects to the majority of the houses in this town were built over 100, 130 years ago. Yeah. But now we have, again, not to get political, but there is a big challenge here, not just in Watertown, but in Ogdensburg, Messina, Syracuse, Utica. We have all these buildings that in the Northeast, especially up here with the salt, which didn't exist 60, 70 years ago. The salt is in the air. It's destroying a lot of these houses. Roofs, for instance. Once a roof goes, forget it. You might as well just shut the place down. How is it, and how much time does an old house over 80, 90, 100 years, how long could they last uninhabited? And why is it a house that isn't lived in, Tom? Even though there's some basic maintenance to keep it up, you know, continuing to have why does a house die so much quicker when no one's living in it?
It's because there's no one to care for it.
Is that it, or does it have anything to do with, you know, just the aspect of air conditioning, heating, living in some, maintenance and so forth? But it seems like a house starts to die the moment no one's living in there anymore.
Yeah, I honestly think it's like the stitch in time saves nine. You know, if you're there and you know that there's a leak in the ceiling, you're going to fix it because you don't want your furniture to get wet.
Exactly.
But if there's no one there taking care of the place, then it's just gonna go. But I know exactly what you're talking about, and I know also in the region that there's been struggle with population, that people have been leaving.
Sure.
But I believe that, you know, if you want people to stay, then we need to make this place someplace that people want to live.
Well, I mean, again, that's where I wanted to get. I mean, I spoke to a realtor right here a couple of weeks back, and a very interesting aspect to what's gone on here in the North Country. And again, there's a silver lining to everything. We just went through COVID-19. We still are. It seems like the light is at the end of the tunnel. But one thing is for sure, Tom, and perhaps you've saw this yourself, a lot of people started migrating to closer to home, or maybe to a waterfront property that's within 2 hours away from Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, whichever. A lot of properties have sold in the last year, and this is a big thing. Yeah. And you couple that with the fact that, you know, the quality of life here is outstanding. Now, people are realizing, again, I know you lived in the Baltimore area, but a lot of people are, you know, thinking, you know, maybe living in a city isn't as safe. Maybe it's not what it used to be, and it certainly isn't. Do you see that there might be a migration to places like this, despite the fact that people don't like cold weather, Tom?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I still go back down to Charleston with some occasion, and I did a lecture at my college there. And I mentioned to some of the students that I had purchased this house and showed them what I had done, and mentioned that, you know, the price that I paid for it.
Right.
And people looked at me shocked and amazed.
They must have went nuts.
Yeah, and they said, "Where are you living?"
Right,
and
yeah.
so I told them, you know, and you know, whether they come or not, I'm not sure. But with COVID and with remote working and Zoom meetings, it's opened up a whole new world of possibility to people that we didn't need before.
One thing is for sure, and again, I've been living here for over 3 decades, and we have a place. We have the luxury of saying that we have a place in Point Peninsula. And I don't tell people what we bought it for and whatnot, but the rule of thumb typically is $1,000 a foot of now it might have gone up since then because of what's going on in the realty market, especially on waterfront. But when people hear that, like, what? And that's why a lot of people are buying houses on the river or on the lakefront, unsight unseen, because they just can't get over how cheap it is to buy a property up here. So hopefully that will spell a better future for us. I'm not saying we're in dire straits, but at the end of the day, we lost over 4,000 people in the latest census from 2010. So hopefully that will go in the other direction, Tom.
And one thing, just for me personally, I found that coming to a place like this where you can make a difference. Like Charleston's safe.
Yes.
As much as I like being there, and as much as I enjoy the work of fixing up old buildings, those buildings are safe. There are people there who can do it. But here in Watertown, I feel like I can make a difference, and I want to make a difference because I think that this is a really great community here, and there's a lot that can be done. And so I think that other people would find that too. There's a real joy in going to a place that's more intimate and where things are a little bit closer together, and the way that people operate is a little bit more like the good old days rather than the mess that you see now.
The stuff that we're seeing right now, which again is unfortunate, but again, that's for another day. But to speak to Tom, Tom Podhrazsky, I hope I'm not screwing up your name there.
No, you got it, Tom Podhrazsky.
But go to his website, and I'm going to have you do the liberties to say, what is your website? Where can people go?
Yeah, it is thpodhrazsky.com, and that's THPODHRAZSKY.
All right. Now, when all this is done, of course, we'll have that on the screen and whatnot. But the main thing is, and how I met Tom, of course, is that you are right across the street, and your artwork is displayed at Fibonacci. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Fibonacci.
Fibonacci. Excuse me, I forgot the end. Sorry about that, folks. But your work is amongst 7, 8 other artists over there at Fib.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there are 8 other artists, and there's it's a great group of artists.
Yeah, and it's great to see because Watertown always was the hub for the cultural hub with movie theaters, vaudeville theaters here back, a long time ago, and art was very essential to Watertown. It kind of took a holiday, if you will, for some time, and a lot of people have to be reintroduced to that, including people that are at a bar like Colasante's or Pewter Mug or anything of that nature, because anyone, at the end of the day, everyone can appreciate art, Tom.
Yeah, well, as I was saying before, I think that, everybody's got to pay the bills, and there's things that you got to do to live. But I think art and beauty is what we live for.
Yes, I totally agree.
There are a lot of really noble things to pursue in life, and I think art is maybe just one of them. But
real quick before we go, you had mentioned that Cuba wasn't your favorite place. What was your favorite place that you visited?
This is going to sound. It's got a tie.
Okay.
Can I have a 3-way tie?
That's fine.
Yeah, my 3-way tie. France is wonderful.
So you went to Paris?
Paris, south of France is even better.
Right.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
Especially if you can eat. That's good.
And I hear the women are beautiful there.
Yeah. Well, most things in France are beautiful, but especially the women.
Yeah, sure.
And then Japan, and then oddly enough, Uzbekistan was up there.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. Well, you just don't know until you go someplace and
Right.
see.
Now, one other thing that Tom shared with me is that a lot of other countries do a lot of other things better than Americans, and there's a litany of things, we won't get into it. But the one thing that Tom noticed was breakfast is better in America. not to sound like a Supertramp song or album for that matter, but why is breakfast in America better than anywhere else?
I can't put my finger on why, but it's just true.
You went to Britain, and apparently Britain is famous for beans for breakfast.
Yeah, well, I mean, the full British breakfast is sort of like an American breakfast, but it's just not quite as good. It's like free fried beans
Right.
and all kind of, like the Irish. They'll have all kinds of strange puddings and things. That,
Right.
God bless them. I love the Irish.
Yeah.
It's just not what I want to have for breakfast.
No, I agree.
But,
I'm Irish, and I agree with you.
Yeah, I don't subscribe too much to American exceptionalism, but definitely with breakfast. There's no other place in the world that you want to have breakfast than
Breakfast
here
for
in
champions
US
to get
of
your
A.
day started.
Yeah.
And of course, 99% of people get breakfast have it in a drive-through in a styrofoam box.
Well, yeah.
You know how that is.
I'm talking about, you go home on Sunday and your mom
Right.
fried eggs and pancakes and bacon and the fresh orange juice and the whole thing.
Yeah, and just bear in mind that our breakfast, probably our servings are a lot bigger than theirs too.
Yeah. Well,
and we are too.
well, we work. That's
that's
the
true.
that comes from the agricultural heritage of not only this region but just the country.
Well, let me ask you though, real quick: are we bigger on average than other people because of the food that we eat and the processed food that we've consumed in the last 50, 60 years?
Well, I mean, I don't really know that I can't speak to that with any sort of expertise.
Well, and neither can I. I'll say it anyway. Yeah. We are way too big in comparison to others. And I'll tell you this. You go on Facebook and you just see nostalgic Facebook pages of life in the 60s or the 50s or the Catskills, and you see pictures of people at a beach scene or Coney Island. And although the fashions were different, and I'm talking even as early, not too long ago, in the 70s and early 80s, we were in much better shape, Tom. What happened to us?
Well, I don't know. I think part of it is that we've got an increasingly sedentary lifestyle where there's more and more people working in office jobs and just spending, like, kids want to stay at home and play in a video game rather than go outside and throw a baseball. You know?
Right.
I think also just the quality of our food is not what it used to be.
Not what it used to be. Yeah.
There's a lot of additives and a lot, microwave dinners and all kinds of things that. Yeah. I mean, I get it. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do to feed yourself.
Sure,
but,
no doubt. But I think it's also been too easy to get fatty foods, for $6-7. Although these days, going through a drive-through for lunch, you're spending 10, 11, $12 sometimes.
Yeah, I don't do it often, but every time I do, I'm sort of shocked.
I'm shocked myself.
Yeah.
I don't know who's worse, Wendy's or McDonald's, one or the other. It's like, are there two other people in here? What happened to the $5 meal? That seems to be disappeared.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed is that half the world lives on beans and rice, and beans and rice is pretty cheap.
Yeah, pretty cheap, and probably you're talking about people from Asia that for the most part live longer and are healthier than we are.
I mean, even in Central America and Mexico and Dominican Republic, like that's the Dominican Republic. That's like the staple food.
Yeah, and you mentioned you went to real quick. You went to Dominican Republic. Well, why was that? Did you ever have an opportunity to go to Haiti on the same island?
No, unfortunately not. I really wanted to. There's some really cool sites, and I actually had a roommate that did some mission work there, but I never got to.
Probably after the earthquake.
Yeah.
In 08 or 07, I can't remember now.
Yeah.
Tom Podhrazsky here from the White Pine Studio. Well, that was the name of your company, the White Pine Studio Design and Restoration, but also at Fibonacci. Am I saying that correct?
Fibonacci.
Fibonacci. I'm so sorry, Tom. I got to get that right. It's literally across the street. Fibonacci, the gallery that used to be a slew of other businesses. It's so good. It's a breath of fresh air to see art at its best right here in downtown Watertown in the American Corner where it belongs. Tom, thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for having me. I really appreciate it.
And we'll have you on my radio show one of these days, too, on AM 1240's Live at 5 show. This is Glenn Curry signing off for this segment of the H2O show right here from the H2O studios overlooking beautiful historic public square. We hope you have a good day, and we'll see you soon.